Well, we've seen how to import data from Azure Storage, and that's useful if you have a big data process that's generated some data files. But what if you want to get some data from a relational database, like Azure SQL database, for example? Let's take a look at how we can get data from a database into our Azure Machine Learning experiment. So here's the Azure portal, and if I take a look at the resources I have this diabetes data SQL database here, and I can go and look at the details of that. And I can see that that is on a server called SQL01234.database.windows.net is the fully qualified name. So I've got a server that contains my database. And I've connected to that server using this SQL Server Management Studio client tool. And if I take a look, there's the server I'm connected to. If I take a look at its databases, there's my diabetes data database. And I could look at the tables in there as well. There's a table called dbo.doctors. And if I just go and get the top 1,000 rows from that table, we can see what it contains. And it's basically a bunch of patient IDs and physicians. So in other words, for each patient, who is the physician who's assigned to that patient. So that's potentially some useful data for me to add to my experiment. So I'm going to go and have a look at my Azure Machine Learning Studio. So here's the experiment I'm working on. I've already imported the patient data from Azure Storage. Now I want to get the data from my Azure SQL database. And to do that, again, we're just going to use our import data module. And this time, we'll launch the wizard again. And instead of bringing it from Azure Blob Storage this time, we're going to choose Azure SQL Database. So we could use any of these various different types, but in this case, our data is in Azure SQL Database. And so we'll set up the same subscription information. That's the name of the database server. That's the name of the database. And I need the credentials that I'm going to use to connect to it. So we'll just type in the username and password that I want to use. And I can go and test that connection. And it succeeded, so that connection is going to work for me. And then I need to specify the query that I want to use to extract the data. So I could use any SQL statement that's going to work with the tables in that data. We have a fairly simple example in this case with only one table, so we're just going to select the patient ID and the physician from the dbo.doctors table. So that's set up to go and query that database. I'm also just going to complete the experiment by joining the results of that to my patient data. So we'll go and drag the patient into there and the doctors into there. We just need to tell it which column is the common column. Now we've already run the patient data import, so it knows what columns are in there. We actually renamed them using the edit metadata, so we're going to use our patient ID column. For the other side, for the key field that's coming from the doctors table, well, we haven't run that yet, so it doesn't really know what we've got in there, but we happen to know from the query that we're going to have a field called patient ID. So we can go ahead and just specify that. I click away. And as well as joining them, the match case is irrelevant because it's a number. We're going to use a left outer join just in case I have some patients that don't have doctors assigned to them. And I'm not going to keep the right key column. There's no real reason for me to have two copies of the patient ID in my data set, so we'll just stick with the original patient ID column from here, and we'll drop the one that we're bringing in from the import. So let's go ahead and run the experiment. And when the experiment's completed, I can go and look at the output from the join. And I've got all my original patient data, the ID, the number of pregnancies, the various measurements I've taken from them. But I've now also got the physician, which I've got from my Azure SQL database.